25%. That's where it started. A blanket tariff on Canada, slapped on in March of last year with the confidence of a man who has spent 2 years telling anyone with a microphone that America doesn't need a single thing from its neighbor to the north, not the oil, not the power, not the lumber, nothing. And then, within days, on one specific Canadian product, he quietly cut that tariff to 10. And then, a little while later, even more quietly, he dropped it the rest of the way to 0. 25 to 10 to 0 on one product, in one season, from the man who doesn't need anything from Canada. And when that still wasn't enough, when the retreat still didn't solve the problem, he sat down with one of the last dictators in Europe, traded away a sanctions regime, negotiated with a regime that rigged an election, that let Putin stage part of an invasion from its soil, that jailed hundreds of its own people for protesting in the streets. And the thing he was shopping for in that meeting was fertilizer, not oil, not semiconductors, not weapons technology, fertilizer from Canada. Today we are talking about potash. You have probably never thought about it once in your life. And that is exactly why it is the most quietly devastating card Canada holds in this entire trade war. A dull pink rock dug out of the ground in one Canadian province, and it sits underneath the single most basic thing a country has to be able to do, which is feed itself. Every major crop on Earth needs 3 nutrients to grow at scale: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Miss any one of them and yields don't dip. They collapse. Not a bad harvest. A failed crop. Nitrogen the United States can mostly make for itself. Phosphorus it has in Florida. But potassium, which is what potash is, that comes out of the ground in only a few places on Earth where an ancient sea dried up and left its mineral salts buried deep in the rock. The largest, richest, most accessible deposit on the entire planet sits under the prairie of one Canadian province, Saskatchewan. 11 mines, more than 1 billion tons of reserves, roughly a third of everything the world produces, all from a stretch of flat farmland most Americans couldn't find on a map. Now here is the number that turns a boring mineral into a pressure point. The United States imports between 85 and 90% of the potash it uses from Canada. Not half, not most, nearly all of it. America digs up barely 400,000 tons a year domestically. It needs 11 to 12 million. That gap is filled almost entirely by trucks and trains rolling south out of Saskatchewan. The breadbasket of the world runs on Canadian rock. And there is no real substitute and no quick way out. After Canada, the next largest potash producers on Earth are Russia and Belarus. Both sanctioned, both hostile. There is a little from Germany, a trickle from Laos, a bit from Israel. Add all of it together and it does not come close to replacing Saskatchewan. So when an American politician daydreams about cutting Canada out, the honest menu of alternatives reads like a bad joke. Beg the Russians. Beg the Belarusians. Or tell American farmers to make do with less and watch the harvest shrink. That is the entire list. So here is what Trump actually did. And the sequence, once you understand what's sitting underneath it, is almost comic. The 25% tariff lands. It lands on potash along with everything else. The reaction from the American farm lobby is instant and furious. These are not coastal liberals. These are Trump's own people. The farm states. The reddest country on the map. And they understand immediately what this means for their fertilizer bill, already running north of a third of the entire operating budget on a corn or wheat farm, right as planting season begins. The phones in Washington light up, and Trump blinks. 25 to 10. Then somebody points out potash falls under his own trade agreement, the one he signed, and it drops to 0. The man who says America needs nothing from Canada had just been taught in public that America cannot plant a season without it, and if you think that taught him the lesson, it didn't. By December, he was back at it. Same threat, same confidence. From a man who had already been forced to retreat from it once and learned nothing in between. Saskatchewan's premier didn't bluster back. He just said, "Take the president seriously, but not literally. Don't take the bait," and moved on. That is the posture of a man who knows the cards in his hand beat the other guys. But here is where it stops being merely embarrassing. Because Trump doesn't like being cornered, and the potash corner is a tight one. So he went looking for a way out. And the way he chose tells you everything. His administration cut a deal with Belarus. Belarus, run by Alexander Lukashenko, Europe's last dictator, a man who rigged an election, answered his own people's protests with mass arrests, and handed his country to Putin as a staging ground for the invasion of Ukraine. The United States had sanctioned Belarus over exactly that. The deal was this. Belarus releases 123 political prisoners. The U.S. begins lifting potash sanctions. The prisoners who got their freedom are real people, and I'm glad they got it. But strip away the humanitarian framing and look at the machinery underneath. One of the engines driving that negotiation was a hunt for potash that wasn't Canadian. The leader of the free world went shopping for fertilizer in the basement of a dictatorship. Because the alternative was admitting how completely he depended on the country he keeps insulting. Think about how badly you have to need something to go looking for it in Minsk, and it still doesn't solve it. Belarus cannot replace Saskatchewan. Nobody can. Building a new potash mine means sinking shafts a kilometer into the earth. It costs billions. It takes a decade. The United States has a couple of small domestic projects scratching toward maybe a few 100,000 tons someday, against a need of 12 million. That is a rounding error with a press release attached. Unable to actually replace Canadian potash, the administration added it to the official critical minerals list, a quiet confession that losing it would be an emergency. Then opened a DOJ investigation into Canadian fertilizer companies for price fixing. The industry rolled its eyes. When you genuinely have options, you do not investigate your supplier. You just buy elsewhere. The fact that Washington was reduced to legal threats and dictator diplomacy is the loudest possible confession that there is nowhere else to buy. You can call your neighbor anything you like. You can threaten them, tariff them, insult them, tell the cameras you don't need them for a thing. But if they're the ones who grow what feeds your people, they were never really the weaker party in the conversation. They just had the manners not to say it out loud. Trump tariffed Canada's potash. Then he untariffed it, twice. Then he went to Minsk. And none of it changed the one fact sitting underneath all of it. America cannot feed itself without Canada. Not this year. Not for many years to come. He found out the hard way. Now you know it too.